Welcome to the Ryerson Negotiation Project. My guest today is Peter Harder. Welcome to our show, Peter.
Glad to be here.
Peter is a former senior deputy minister in the Government of Canada. He served in the Treasury Board, Solicitor General, Citizenship and Immigration, Industry, Foreign Affairs, and International Trade. I believe it was in that position that you served as personal representative of the Prime Minister on 3 G8 summits. He has been given the Prime Minister's Outstanding Achievement Award for Public Service Leadership in 2000, the Queen Elizabeth Jubilee Medal in 2002, and he was appointed to the Trudeau Foundation in 2009-2010. Currently, Mr. Harder is president of the Canada-China Business Council. He also serves on a number of different boards, both private as well as charitable, some of which are the Power Financial Group, Magna International, Northland Power, Telesat Canada, United Church Foundation, the Commonwealth Games Foundation of Canada, and several others, including the National Arts Centre. Peter, we're just delighted that you're able to join us today, and I'd like to raise as the first issue, because you've been involved in so many different public policy things, but your tenure, for instance, at Treasury Board, you would have had to deal with unions at the forefront during that period of time. What was your sort of mode of preparations as you prepared for these kinds of negotiations?
Well, the period 1995 to 2000 were ones of very significant change in Government of Canada. We went through what was called program review, which was in a sense a very deliberate look at all of the activities of the Government of Canada to determine whether or not they were still appropriate for the government to undertake, whether they were affordable, whether the program delivery could be transformed. All of these questions were looked at with a view of both making government more modern and appropriate for its citizens, but also, quite frankly, to reduce government expenditures. And that included a period in which there was an imposed freeze of wages and a suspension of collective bargaining. What I'm proud of is when we returned to collective bargaining, we, without a strike, negotiated agreements with a wide range of unions for a 3%, 2%, and 1% increase over 3 years after a number of years of freezes. And we did that, I think, in part because the workers in the public service understood that this transformation through program review was about preserving the institution of government and making it more relevant and more sustainable. It wasn't about doing something on the backs of the workers. And as we approached collective bargaining, we decided to do two things. One was to separate out the negotiating team in the room from the strategic advice of what did we want to achieve in terms of labor flexibilities, in terms of some of the rationalizing of bargaining groups.
Could you just qualify that a bit? You said there was two teams?
Well, the person we put in charge of the negotiations was a very effective senior public servant. But we also had a committee of deputies and an outside group of advisors that helped shape our strategy in the negotiations. It wasn't just about how do we respond to the demands, it was how do we articulate what we wish to accomplish. And are we being, frankly, strategic in how we pursued our negotiations? And that helped a lot. We had a very senior private sector, well-experienced labor lawyer give us his advice, volunteer basis I should add, on how to conduct our labor negotiations. And it proved very valuable advice. At the same time, we had you'll remember this, the equal pay for work of equal value dispute. And we were able to resolve that through, at the end of the day, a private negotiation between myself as Secretary of the Treasury Board and the then head of the major union, where we were able to reach an agreement on a final settlement without going to an appeal of the judgments that were made. And I'm proud of that too, because it took out of the workplace some of the tensions and issues that were in play at a price that was significantly below what might have happened in an adverse judgment.
So we're dealing with public policy and public issues. But on that preparation, you would have had meaningful discussions with other deputy ministers of the Government of Canada. You would have had input from political masters, obviously. And then you had your strategy committee and outside advice to hone you with strategy and time frame. And then, of course, you had the actual negotiator who was at the table.
Correct.
Enormous amount of preparation.
Yeah. But in the end, it achieved our strategic objectives, which was to reach a settlement without a strike with a financial settlement that was within our fiscal framework.
Now, when did it become apparent, in your view, this is a subjective test here, when did it become apparent, in your view, that the other side recognized that you were attempting to preserve the institution of government, enhance it where you could, keeping in mind that we're in a very difficult economy, therefore we're not going to shove this against the poor worker?
Well, I think there are some lessons here that are generic in negotiations. One is always be respectful. Don't vilify the other side. Two, always leave a way out for compromise. So when compromise happens, there hasn't been winners and losers in a classic sense. The third is make timing your friend. Timing on negotiations can be your enemy or it can be your friend. And you have to have a deliberate consideration of when do you put on the table what, with a view of how is my timing going to enhance and give leverage to what I want to achieve. And we had a whole series of circumstances, I think, that allowed those factors to play.
Tell us your view in terms of where good relationships, are they important? Are they irrelevant? Are they neutral? How would you describe good relationships?
Good relationships are a precondition, in my view, of a sustained relationship that leads to serial negotiations. If you're just doing a one-off and you never want to see the other side again, sure, you can be a little more abrasive and a little more demanding, but at the end of the day, they may not call on you again to lead those negotiations or to put themselves in a position where negotiations with you are what they have to face. If you want to have a sustained relationship, it involves respect. It certainly involves understanding. Study the other side's case. Just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean there isn't a logic to it. And as I say, don't back anybody into a corner that doesn't have a door.
How would you describe your listening skills?
I hadn't thought of that.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
As I watched you at Treasury Board, as I watched you in various portfolios of the Government of Canada, you were a very active listener. People would say things, whether you agreed or disagreed, you made sure that you understood as to where they were coming from. You did it skillfully, much better than I could ever do it, but you had that ability in terms of listening and getting the other person to quantify if need be, qualify if need be, and elaborate in terms of what they were actually saying. From my perspective, I think your listening skills were way up there in terms of dealing with the various constituencies. Any examples come to mind where your listening skills paid off for you?
I'll talk about one. You mentioned in your introduction the work I did in the G8 context. Now, to be the Prime Minister's personal representative in the G8 is a very privileged relationship to have with your peer group, because the G8 is an institution where the only people in the room are the leaders and their so-called Sherpa or their personal representative. So it's a very small group. And these meetings are prepared by the personal representatives who meet similarly in a group only with themselves. They may have outside advisors, but they're outside the room.
Physically outside.
Physically outside the room. And we meet in preparation for the G8 summit on a very regular basis. So you have all of the big issues of the day in which you're seeking to achieve consensus, because the G8 operates on consensus, what is on the agenda of the time. And Canada is the 8th member of the G8. We're not number 1 or number 2. And our influence comes, I think, from having listening skills and seeking where could the consensus emerge, and how do we bias that emergence of a consensus in alignment with our interests. And in the nature of those private conversations, there is a way where Canada can propose a possible solution that can meet, let's say, American and French support, where if it was a solution proposed by one or the other of those principles, it perhaps wouldn't be viewed as a consensus objective. And there were a number of those where I think Canada was able to exercise what we are proud of, which is a quiet diplomacy of achievement by getting progress made on such issues as climate change with a consensus that surprised some of the countries holding a view that we would never get that far. And I want a bottle of scotch on this, so it must have worked.
So would you say that that's a Canadian value that we have in terms of the consensus building?
I think that I don't want to go be overly maudlin about this, but I do think that the Canadian Public Service is a professional cohort that is very trained to be listening to the direction of political masters and being almost a requirement of the job is to give professional advice. To give your advice free and fairly. And the obligation on the political side is to listen to the advice and decide, not to accept necessarily, but to decide. And that respectful relationship is in our classic governance a highly prized value of our public service. And I think it operates very well when it operates well in the international area in particular.
Trust.
Trust, understanding, walking in the other person's shoes, understanding that most of life is working in the gray areas, not the black and white areas.
So would you deem trust to be an important quality for the purposes of a negotiator?
Absolutely. Trust of your team behind you, trust of your adversary with whom you are seeking a resolution. They have to trust that you can deliver, and they have to trust that you will hold confidences that are, by the very nature of the negotiations, brought to you by the other side.
What sort of behavior, from your perspective, would give another person some assurance that, hey, I'm a trustworthy individual in terms of this particular deliberation or discussion?
That's a good question. I think part of it is what reputation you have come to the negotiations with.
So that would be a precondition.
That's a precondition, and that's perhaps a reputation that you you achieve in roles other than necessarily a negotiation. I think it's important to have, we talked about it, listening skills, to have some degree of empathy, but also to have a point of view. To go into a negotiation and not really be prepared to have a point of view with which you can engage the other side is not terribly helpful either. They have to trust you to be able to state your views and your objectives in a way that gives them the freedom to, in a sense, state theirs, and then you have the interaction that leads to exploring the consensus that you're seeking.
I would argue very similar. I think process is very, very important, but it's also a part of the process is to be substantive on the argument that's before you.
Yeah.
And I think a negotiator who goes in to a discussion and is not substantive, it eats away at the credibility in terms of the argument that is being made.
Yes.
So you really have to have
Yep.
both.
You do, and you have to have enough substantive understanding to see at a higher level. I have observed unsuccessful negotiations where you had the absolute expert, but all they could see were leaves, not even branches, let alone trees. So you have to be able to go from the detail to the big picture in a multifaceted negotiation in particular, and that's an art.
Tell me, in these discussions, where does patience come into play? I mean, I could just imagine sitting down with 7 or 8 representatives of world leaders on a whole host of issues. I think you'd have to be fairly patient.
Yeah, I talked about make timing your friend. Often in particularly international negotiations, the ultimate crunch time is at the very end. And a lot of the hours spent before are the preparation for, it's a bit like basketball, I guess, for the last few seconds. Because nothing is agreed to till everything is agreed to. And there are times when emotion and a forceful statement of a point of view are entirely appropriate and actually skillful tools. But they have to be deliberately chosen, not emotionally driven. The best international negotiator I've seen is the foreign minister of Russia, Minister Lavrov, who can exhibit, when the opportunity commands it as the reasonable way of advancing your point of view, outrage and moral rectitude, and you know he's turning it on, but it's highly effective. The ones that you want to avoid are the ones where they lose it with their emotions and they can't bring it back. Emotions are a tool of negotiation. They're not a result of losing the negotiation momentum.